Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. Joining us today is Professor Robin Dunbar, evolutionary psychologist at the University of Oxford. Robin is best known for his groundbreaking research on the link between brain size and social group size, famously known as Dunbar's number. It suggests that we can maintain meaningful relationships with about 150 people. Our brains have evolved to handle complex social interactions, shaping everything from language to modern social networks. And these insights have lessons for how we lead and organize companies. So, welcome, Professor Dunbar, Robin.
Good to be with you.
Robin, can you tell us what first inspired you to devote your career to looking at how groups form?
Well, I suppose it was a very early experience as an undergraduate. I was taking a degree in philosophy and psychology, and the psychology side insisted we do a project. And a friend of mine wanted to travel overland to somewhere in Africa, and maybe we could do a project at the end of it. We ended up going to Ethiopia, but actually we flew there in the end. But we did a project studying monkeys in the wild, which was very exciting and was completely new from my point of view, because I was just, if you like, a lab psychologist used to studying people and maybe rats occasionally in the lab. So studying natural groups of animals going about their everyday thing was both very exciting and very engaging. So I did a PhD on animals, primates in the wild, and that gradually developed, eventually got transposed across to humans, because it seemed that, well, humans were just the pinnacle of the pyramid of primates, as it were, if you like. We just did things bigger and better than anybody else. So it was a natural kind of progression always, in some sense, of going, oh, that looks interesting. Let's spend some time doing that kind of stuff.
And how did you come about this set of Dunbar numbers?
That was a complete accident. And at one level, I didn't even appreciate the significance of it when I first discovered them. But it came about because somebody else had suggested that the reason primates have much bigger brains than any other animals that have ever lived was the fact they lived in large, complex societies. But that's as far as their proposal went. There was really no data to support that. And I had the idea of using group size as a measure of species typical group size as a measure of social complexity, and plotting that against brain size to see if they were in fact correlated. And it turned out they were. And that made me think, oh, well, I wonder what happens if we project beyond the primate data, since we have brain data for humans in the same data set. We can just plug the human brain data into the same equation and make a prediction for what humans did. And it produced this figure of 150. It turned out later to be right, but for the wrong reason, as I understood it at the time. But essentially, yes, it's all primates, and indeed it's extended beyond that to other species of mammals, are locked into this process whereby the size of the groups and the quality of the groups, let's say the emotional intensity of the groups, is dictated by the size of their brain, and that in turn, it depends on how challenging their environment is. If they don't have to live in a big group to solve the problems of everyday survival, then they don't have to have a big brain. They can just live in small groups with a small brain, and that's a lot cheaper. But if you want to occupy habitats that are very open, very subject to predation, then you need a big group to protect yourself against that. That's what requires a big brain, to manage the relationships within that group in order to hold everybody together on the same page. Otherwise, what happens is what happens in herding species like deer and antelope. Everybody might come together by accident or because there's a predator around, but then once the moment's passed, they just drift apart again, and their relationships with each other are very casual, sometimes only happen once with a particular individual, then you never see them again. Whereas primates are in these permanently bonded social groups, as indeed do humans. So it's very much a complex social world that is in many ways unique. There are other species of animals that aspire to some degree of complexity, but let's say they're not as smart as primates, and therefore they don't
So,
have such big groups.
yeah. What is the significance of these group sizes? You've written about 5, 15, 50,
Okay.
and ultimately 150.
Yes, so this is what's come to be known as the Dunbar graph, as opposed to the Dunbar number. So the Dunbar number technically is this figure of 150, and I guess every species of monkey and ape has its appropriate Dunbar number. However, if you look at the structure of relationships within those groups, then what you find is they're layered in a series of hierarchically inclusive layers, which have very specific numbers. Not only do we find these numbers in the structure of human groupings, so communities or even businesses, but we also find it in the structure of your personal social network. If you look at how frequently you telephone somebody, or the people you in your phone book, how often you post to them on social media as named individuals, how often you contact them face to face, what's very clear is these layers, and these layers occur at about 5, 15, 50, and then 150. And we find those exact same numbers in both the distribution of primate group sizes. They, with some variation around these numbers, they settle on these numbers as optima. And indeed, the species that have big social groups, like chimpanzees or baboons, for example, whose average group size is around 50, what you find is they're internally structured into layers of 15s, and within the 15s, 5s. And so the 5s are in humans, we refer to the 5 as your shoulders to cry on friends. So they're and bear in mind, this social world of yours, your social network, includes not just friends in the usual sense that we mean it, but it includes extended family. And so it goes out to maybe second cousins, not much beyond second cousins, because no culture in the world, no language has terms for people beyond about second cousins, no kinship terms. It's really weird. But second cousins takes you out in a naturally reproducing population, small scale society with no contraception and so on, and high mortality of children. 150 takes you out to about all the descendants of a living apical pair of great-great-grandparents. So if you imagine two great-great-grandparents coming together, all their living descendants under these circumstances would number about 150 people, and that takes you out to about second cousins in principle. But it's really weird. Nobody ever, no culture in the world, no language in the world has kinship terms for less closely related individuals. They're just other people.
Oh, okay. Well, to our viewers, if you've got any questions for Robin, please put them in the comments field. And we have one question from Yukina on LinkedIn, who asked, do you think leadership styles should be adjusted as team sizes change from, let's say, 5, 15, going up the Dunbar graph?
The answer is yes. But perhaps the way to think about it is, and we've actually shown this with business associations, as it were. I'd say not the structure of businesses, but groups of people who perhaps form associations of various kinds, both within businesses and between them, or between institutions of various kinds, governmental departments maybe. Because, and they're forming these because they have common interests. So, accountants get together and discuss matters to do with accountancy, and salespeople get together from different companies and discuss, issues relating to sales. These, if you look at those, the distribution of the sizes of those kind of very casual organizations, you see exactly the same structure: 5s, 15s, 50, 150, and beyond the 150, keeping the rule of three, as it's called, going, 500, 1500. You don't get many beyond about 1500. But what's very interesting about that, we found, was that up to about an association size of 40 people, you could have the whole thing working on a completely democratic basis. Everybody would take their turn organizing a speaker, maybe for the meetings, or making sure there's some coffee and biscuits for those coming to the meeting, because these would usually be face-to-face meetings. Once you got above about 40, however, it needed some kind of hierarchical structure to it. So it needed a management structure of some sort. And at that point, you started to see committees appearing, which took on responsibility. So in your unit size is small, you basically don't need to have any kind of management structure. Everybody knows everybody else. They know what has to be done. They volunteer. Yeah, I'll get some biscuits in, or I'll go and find some speakers, or whatever it is that has to be done to get a nice meeting, as it were. But once the organization gets too big, then you have to have some formal management structure. And I suppose in some sense you see that even in the military. The up to company size, and the average size of companies in the military all around the world is about 150. Some variation around that, of course, but the average is very much 150. Basically, companies work through person-to-person relationships. Everybody knows who everybody else is, and they stick together because of the obligation they feel to each other, because of the way the military organize things for the company. They make them go on long marches through the jungle, or up in the mountains that are very exhausting, and put them under a lot of pressure, and that builds this sense of, and of course, sort of parading and doing drills creates this sense of belonging and membership. Once you get above that, you've got to have very strict discipline. Yes sir to officers. Always salute, always do what somebody who's senior to you, the sergeant or an officer, says. You do it without questioning. Otherwise the whole system just breaks down. If you don't have that kind of disciplinary structure enforced by discipline, you spend the weekend in the guardroom jail if you disobey. If you don't have those kind of imposed disciplinary structures, the whole thing just collapses. And of course, the military is a very special circumstance, if you like, because their lives, their survival depends on everybody doing their job, right, on the battlefield, however the battlefield may be. But even in today's modern warfare, it's still the same. If they don't all do their job, and half of them walk off the battlefield saying, "Oh, we're going on strike. These bullets are too dangerous," then you lose the war. So you have to have these kind of imposed disciplines, and that's very, very ancient. Of course, we wouldn't accept that in the civilian world, but the same principle is really applying, that up to a certain level of grouping, things can be managed on a person-to-person basis, a more personal basis. But after a certain point, you just have to have management structures. The interesting one is the very small groups of 5, I think, in this context, because these are kind of about the size of project work groups. So you've got a little problem, you've got some software that you need building, you get 5 guys in to come and build the software. And what you want at this point is 5 people who are essentially equal, all have the same knowledge base. You want people who are very similar to each other in the way they think and in terms of their knowledge base, because you don't want to waste time having to explain every bit along the way. Let's put some coding in here to do this. You want it in a situation where everybody goes, "Oh, sure, absolutely right thing to do." You don't want people going, "Why do you want to do that?" Because that's very inefficient. So there are these switch points as you go up through things where you can have these very small groups with no leadership at all, which work most efficiently if they're basically homophilous, that everybody's on the same page, they all know the same backstory, if you like, and immediately don't have to. As I sometimes say, you don't have to explain the joke to them. They know already what the joke is, right? But as you go up through the layers, then of course you're bringing more and more people in, and of course then you get people who are not on the same page but are there to provide a kind of wider, more diverse perspective and kind of blue skies input from somewhere else. And then at that point you need a management, and this becomes very clear at committee level. So committees tend to be about 12 to 15, so that's that intermediate level. If you don't have a chairman, you've got big trouble, because the thing will just break down in chaos. You have to have a chair who really dictates who can say what when, right? So that everybody gets a turn to say what they want, but doesn't take over the meeting, which is otherwise what happens very, very quickly. And that was famously experienced on Zoom meetings during lockdown. But we can come back to that maybe. But if you don't have a chair to manage that group and keep the discipline, as it were, then it just ends up as chaos, because it breaks up into a group of, and you can see this happening. If the chair goes out of the room because they've got to take a phone call from the big boss or whatever, everybody starts talking to each other, and it ends up as 4 or 5 little conversations, different parts of the table, and no work is done.
Well, I don't know about biscuits, but I know that Jeff Bezos has this famous anecdote that in Amazon, teams are too large if they can't be fed on one pizza. I don't know, maybe Americans have bigger pizzas, so that's team of 5. Do you know if Jeff Bezos ever read your work and applied that in Amazon?
Not as far as I know. I'm very unlucky if he did, because I've earned no royalties from that.
But have businesses used your research in the way that they organize their teams?
Excuse me. Yes, they have. I mean, there are a number of people who've discovered it and kind of used it as a base structuring system for their businesses or their organizations. In some case, schools, some case government departments, some case consultancies have done so. Because what's interesting about these numbers, which I might just add to reinforce the point, is we've shown mathematically that these numbers 5, 15, 50, 150, and beyond that at least 500, and maybe some hints that this will be true at 1500, though we haven't actually looked at networks of that size. Those numbers are what statistical physicists would call criticalities. They are points at which information flow around the system is optimized. And what you have is kind of valleys in between them, where things just don't work so efficiently. Information doesn't flow so well. We don't quite understand why, but it's a very, very, very strong effect. And one difficulty, of course, is that it means when you increase your group size, you can't increase it by 1s and 2s, because that takes you into the dead ground in between the area of inefficiency. You've got to jump from one peak to the next, and sometimes the peaks are quite far apart. But it's a constraint on, that's to say, if you want to keep the efficiency going rather than grow slowly. So grow fast if you want to grow, or don't grow at all. Stay where you are is the message here. But those values do seem to work out better in terms of organizing smaller groupings for example, within schools or within government departments. We're not talking about organizations the size of Amazon or big multinational, although in principle, of course, however you do it, they are going to be structured in some way, because they may have bits and pieces in every country in the world, but within each country, that's some kind of unit, and then within those country units there will be, sort of substructures within it. So I think we kind of do it naturally. It's just the main thing is or the main message that we promote in our book is don't do the substructuring without thinking very carefully first, right? Understand the processes involved, and what the processes are about are actually about the quality of the relationships between people. Do they know each other? Now, really, the first person to kind of notice this was Bill Gore, when he founded Gore-Tex, the company he set up back in the 60s, 70s to make that material, which all of us are probably wearing Gore-Tex somewhere in our clothing. Hugely successful, but he insisted that no factory or administrative unit should be bigger than 150 people, and they've maintained that rule right the way through, and it allows them to be very efficient because they don't need to have formal hierarchies within the system. Everybody knows who the manager is in the factory. Everybody knows who the accountant is. Everybody knows who the sales team are. Everybody knows who makes the sandwiches in the cafeteria. It all goes on personal relationships and creates this sense of community and belonging and obligation, so that rather than you as the accountant coming along to me in the sales team and saying, you're not doing your sales very well, or we need to restructure how you record all this information. In a big organization, my response in the sales team is, what do you know about that? You go and worry about your stuff up on the finance floor. We'll deal with sales down here. Whereas in a small organization where everybody knows each other personally, I say, well, of course, Conrad, no problem. Let's go and have a beer and talk about it. Completely different style, if you like, of social engagement that just makes the organization work better.
And in your book, The Social Brain, which you co-wrote with colleagues at the Oxford Sci Business School, I think one thing that really struck out to me was that it's not just putting people in these groups. People have to invest or choose to invest time to build those sort of relationships. And I was wondering, when I look at some of these tech companies who seem to try to claim more and more of their employees' time in this name of culture building, right? I think Google calls their headquarters campuses, like
Yes.
dorms, where you're expected to spend all that time. You've got laundromats, pizza parlors, etc. So how does this almost monopolization of an individual's time kind of rewire our social brain for that person?
Well, there's two separate answers here. One is the fact that what they're clearly trying to get at, I think, and Facebook and other people like that in the tech world do similar kinds of things very much. They're trying to create this sense of belonging to a community, and this, so that and this is a problem. If your community is small, it's not rocket science. Everybody knows everybody. It's what happens when your community gets to 15, 20, 30, 40,000 people. And I've heard more people that I can name, as it were, who've said when they started out working for a tech firm and it was a couple of hundred people, it was absolutely great fun. But they suddenly, at one point, they realized it was no longer fun to work there. And that point was when they came into the dining room and they realized they didn't know everybody. And that point, it changed the whole atmosphere of the working environment for them. So it's about how you create friendships. Well, the answer is how we do it in everyday life. It basically is built around spending time together. And we have what we've taken to referring to as the social toolkit, which are these activities which trigger the mechanisms in the brain that create this sense of belonging and bonding. And these are things like laughter, singing, dancing, telling stories, eating together, eating socially together, perhaps going and having a drink together after work, maybe. You have to invest time in these activities if you're going to build up this sense of belonging. And there's an important strand of work here that's come out of Alex Hills down at Greenwich, interest in what he calls centennial organizations. What's the difference? Those are sparked by his observation. Many people had commented on it. I think, if you went back to the 1930s, the average lifespan of a FTSE 250 company, or if that existed then, same in America, was something like 70 or 80 years. It's now 10 years before, it's been taken over, broken up, disappears again. And he wondered why this was, and what was the consequences for the organization in some sense, or for the people who work in it. But anyway, looking at companies that have been around, existing companies now that have been around for over a century and were still with us, compared to ones which had disappeared on very short timescales. There were a number of features in there that he noticed are very characteristic of these long-lived companies. One was they seemed to have a sense of family. They were small. They might have a big pool of itinerant casual people who came in and left, but they were sort of on short contracts, deliberately on short contracts. But they had a central pool that was only about 500 people. That was the core to the thing. It created this sense of a village. They tended to have a sense of social purpose. We're here to do something of value for the wider population, the country, the man in the street. That might be making something that they want, vacuum cleaners, whatever. It might be running a service for them, if you work for a government department, providing roads in the right place and all these kind of things. It might be providing a service for other companies, as in, say, accountancy firms, sort of coming around and looking at your books and checking that everything's okay for you, so that you can present a good picture to the taxman. All these kind of, creating a service in some sense for the wider population, and to be able to have that sense of I'm providing a benefit seemed to be very, very important. There are a number of other things. They tend to have CEOs who are in post for a very long time, not football managers who are here today and gone tomorrow, and abrupt changes. So all these characteristics create this sense of belonging. And I'm very struck by the way some of the Victorian, Edwardian, sort of round about the 1900s, founding fathers of many of the big multinationals. So you think of Unilever, Cadbury's, Mars, all these kind of big companies that are still with us. When they were founded, they were very, very concerned about the well-being of their employees, their workers. And it's very interesting. I mean, not only did they build some very nice accommodation for them, the villages that they built, certainly in Britain, were very different to the kind of crowded slums of the previous centuries on the mill towns of the north, where the workers were really being exploited very badly. But also what they did was that they put social clubs on their campuses. Every campus had a social club and tennis courts and stuff like that, somewhere to have organized meetings, social meetings, dances, what have you. The famous ones are the railway clubs. So all over the world where the railways built by the British, every station had its railway club. If you were if you worked at that station, you were automatically a member of the club. It didn't matter if you're the station master or the sweeper. You belong to the club. You go to the dances on Saturday night. You go and sort of listen to the lectures by some invited speaker, and that created this sense of belonging. I think very much in the Japanese sense of the way the Japanese car industries worked in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. I think that was part and parcel of their secret of their success in when they exploded, as it were, and took over the world of car manufacture. Very much built around this sense of, well, they had a word for it, the employees. I'm a company man. I belong. This is my village. So it's built on face-to-face word. So there's a sense in which an efficient organization is like a well-run village, that it runs itself. It's small enough to run itself as a democratic unit, but you can bolt units together into a hierarchy as long as you've got some kind of management. But the fatal thing is to try and micromanage it. You have to have trust in your under managers, under leaders, as it were, at each level, and I guess give them some freedom too, in the sense of not dictating how everything should be, but say, okay, you're the man on the factory floor, the woman on the factory floor. You figure out how best to do it. We'll back you. Of course, if they make mistakes, they must pay the price. But you have to give them freedom to kind of figure out what it is that works best. But that sense of creating this sense of obligation that you have means that, when parts of the system aren't working, instead of everybody blaming each other, they all pull together to try and sort it out.
Yes, and Arin on LinkedIn says she remembers the railway clubs at the railway stations in Nigeria. And I'm also reminded of some of the famous football clubs in Europe that actually came from the big factory companies like Philips or Bayer, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Robin, you talk a lot about the importance of that investing time, that face-to-face interaction. But of course, the whole world went through a few years where we went through largely work from home. And I saw Amazon CEO Andy Jassy, who is making all their corporate employees return to the office 5 days a week. In his memo, it says it's about improving the culture.
Yes.
Because so many people joined during the pandemic, they never met one another. Do you think working in the office 5 days a week is actually beneficial, or do you think work from home has made it harder to build that kind of corporate culture?
I think the problem is these kind of social cultures, as you like, of the village can only be made face to face. You have to provide context in which it can be done, right? So you can think of it in another term. We have all the diversity considerations that every company worries about in their hiring, and I kind of look at it and I go, yeah, well, that's fine, but if they don't talk to each other, what have you done? Nothing's happened. You've got to provide a context in which they can build face-to-face relationships. They will do it because we're human. It's just natural. But you have to provide the kind of right environment that encourages them to come in. So, clearly, part of the problem here has been the enormous growth of large cities and so many businesses, organizations, factories, whatever, cluster into these hubs for perfectly sensible reasons of transport, access to raw materials or whatever it may be. But the price we've paid is you end up with people having to commute from half a world away to get into work because the price of housing is so expensive in city centers. So I think lockdown clearly persuaded people that there was a great joy to be had from not having to go into work every day. And some people have always worked like that. Journalists have always worked like that. Academics often have worked like that, and particularly in the the non-sciences. If you're in the sciences, you have a lab, you've got to go in to do whatever you do. If you're not a scientist, humanities person, or social sciences, you can go and work away in peace and quiet where nobody will disturb you by working at home. But that kind of relieving of the cost of and tedium of and stress of commuting clearly was seen as very beneficial. And I'm sure everybody enjoyed the relaxation of those pressures. But the problem is, at the end of the day, if you aren't there in a face-to-face engagement, things aren't going to happen. right? It becomes very mechanized rather than spontaneous, and can point to lots of examples of how important that is. For example, well, my favorite example is actually the molecular biology lab in Cambridge, Cambridge University, because when it was set up in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was no such thing as biochemistry and molecular biology. It was one of the first labs. But its founding father decided the most important thing about the building, was to have a very good, very cheap, if not free, restaurant. Because he said, if we don't have a cheap, good quality food, people were just going to have their sandwiches at their desk and they won't talk to each other. But if you're enticed to come down at lunchtime to the restaurant, then by pure casual things, you'll bump into people, you'll talk to them, and ideas will come. And my defense of this is that one lab has some absurd number of Nobel Prizes. I think it's in the mid-20s, 27 or something like that. That is more than 80% of all the world's universities. Just that one lab, it's amazing. And I put it to you that this is simply because of the way they designed the system that would it persuade people to come and eat together and therefore talk to each other, right? And there are all sorts of other famous examples. I mean, the classic Copenhagen model of the atom, for example, in physics, the standard model of the atom, that came out of a professor's dining club in Copenhagen. As a consequence of them talking to each other casually. And famously, it is alleged that Watson and Crick came up with the model for DNA while they were drinking beer together in one of the pubs in central Cambridge. Every pub in central Cambridge now claims that they sat there and invented it, of course. But it probably was true. I mean, they would go for a beer and after a seminar or something, and that's how they kind of got talking to each other. So there are lots of casual examples of that kind of thing. But I think what's been interesting has been some of the studies that were published in the light of lockdown, which were looking at information exchange. So we did one study which was based around MIT, looked at the email traffic within the whole of MIT. Microsoft did a study of their own entire workforce, 60,000 people. And the burden that came out both of these studies was the frequency of traffic within your little research group, let's say within the lab you worked in, wasn't affected by lockdown. What was affected were two other important things. One was casual emails with people outside your lab group. So the people you met around the water cooler or at a committee meeting or something, or a seminar, and you got talking to them and you went, oh, we have something in common to discuss here. Let's get together. That fell through the floor. And then the other thing that happened was, because everybody was trying to keep a sense of community going with Zoom and other forms of virtual conferencing technology, people was ending up spending even more time in committees on Zoom than they had done in real life. So because they felt they could be there. But of course, what happened on Zoom, as everybody found out after a while, is that because of constraints on the number of people we can talk to at any one time, which is very, very rigorous, you cannot have more than 4 people in a conversation. If you have 5, it'll split into 2 conversations, 2 completely separate conversations within 30 seconds, right? So what happens what's happening on Zoom is the 4 people with the louded voices would dominate the conversation, and they were probably the group leaders. And everybody else went to sleep in the background, or they checked their news feeds, or they looked out of the window to watch the cat playing with the birds in the garden and weren't paying attention at all. But they were not doing anything useful work-wise because they felt they had to be online and be seen to be online. So there is all that sense of it's often not very productive. And I remember, I mean, the thing is, this is not the first time this has happened. We tried it once in the 1990s because I was involved in a number of workshop conferences built around this. It was then called home working. And a lot of the first technology to allow virtual conferencing had been developed, and companies were very keen to send people off to their dachas in the countryside with a laptop and just call in when they needed to. And then they could have a much smaller building, headquarters building, say in central London, where the rental prices were extremely expensive. They could reduce those costs. And they were advised very, very strongly by the advisors that they consulted on this to invest a lot of the money that they saved from this into providing occasions when everybody could get together and meet. And they said basically you needed somebody who could, in addition to that, you needed somebody who could monitor people's well-being. In effect, it was before well-being became a buzzword, but that's what they were really talking about. They said you needed somebody who could phone up somebody working at home and just know from their tone of voice on the phone whether they were still engaged or whether they were burning out or anything like that. And you could not work efficiently, otherwise the whole thing would just become too disrupted. And I remember at one of the meetings that I was at, a couple of guys, senior managers from one of the big multinationals, were saying, well, they had hit this problem completely and unexpectedly, because they decided they were going to rebuild their headquarters campuses. They had several headquarters campuses which were scattered around part of the countryside, and they would put them all in one place. They would have a smaller campus, so they would save space, and they would give everybody laptops, send them off, and they would make life very nice when you came into work. You come into work when you need to come into work. There'll be hot desking, even for senior leaders. No private rooms. Well, there'd be some private rooms for private meetings, but managers wouldn't have expensive rooms with 6-inch pile carpets, these kind of things. And they would make, a gym and a nice boutique clothes shops and very good quality restaurants, and it would be a nice environment to come into, to invite you in. And they said they were completely blindsided because they thought the senior leaders would say, well, what about my, big office with the drinks cabinet and, there's 8 receptionists and 5 typists and all these kind of things. No, they said, great, just give us the laptop. We're going home. We can play golf at lunchtime. I can pick the kids up from school and take them to school in the morning instead of having to leave, very early. The people that complained bitterly were the 20-somethings, the young graduates who just come, because they said, what do you mean? We come into work to see our friends. This is the only social life we have because we don't know anybody here. And this has been the big problem of loneliness in that cohort. They're moving from a world in which their friendship circles were always being provided for them, school, halls of residence at university, colleges, whatever it may be. Suddenly they get their first job after graduating in a big city, which they don't know anybody. They don't know where to go to meet people. And they just end up locked away in a bedsit somewhere, getting depressed. And if you get depressed, you get expose yourself to the risk of physical illnesses as well. Things that you wouldn't, if you were bouncing and happy, wouldn't really bother you, like winter colds and so on. You just kind of go into work. When you're depressed, it's one more thing on the camel's back, and you stay in bed. So everybody's losing out, because if you're not in work, then your colleagues are having to, fill in your work rota for you, and so on and so forth. So this has been a big problem in that age group, and here it was in completely black and white. The only place they could make friendships socially was with people at work. So if they weren't coming in to see them, suddenly they had no social life, and it was going to make things actually worse for the company. So, so these kind of things are unexpectedly complicated in that sense, that they don't always seem obvious at the time. What seems like the obvious thing to do can sometimes have very adverse consequences for the way an organization functions.
Yeah, and of course, loneliness is not just something that's afflicting the 20-year-olds who had to go through COVID lockdowns in universities and then in their work, but it's a big issue for people, especially males, I think, when they get older. I think there's that loneliness epidemic.
Yeah. But I mean, I mean, there are gradations, as it were, across the age span. But I mean, this loneliness pandemic in the 20-somethings, the young graduate starters, is one aspect of it. But then you have the same problem with people coming from other countries and other cultures. Not only do they not know where to go to meet people, but they haven't embedded yet in the culture. So they've got two problems instead of one. So it's a very, very widespread problem. What's interesting to some extent is the fact that if you come as a married couple, like you come with a family, it makes it, of course, much easier for you to adjust because you have somewhere to go back. Of course, the family still has to make its family friendships where it lives, but at least you have some buffering, which prevents you sort of sitting, getting depressed in your bedroom with nobody to talk to. We forget these things at our peril, basically.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, for those insights. And I hope the people who are watching, listening, can take some of this back with us when we think about corporate bonding and design, whether that's design of people's times, design of organizational structure, or even the physical design. The balance sheet will be back next week, 11th October, 12:45 p.m. UK time. We'll have Raman Korno, an alum of CJPS, who will tell us how he started a travel fintech in the very month when COVID brought everything to a halt. So till then, stay well, and we'll see you next time.